Hello, nerds for Yang.
Hello, nerds!
Hello, nerds!
Hello, nerds!
Hello, nerds! Hello, nerds!
Hello, nerds!
Now with this campaign, bang, dang, it's and Drew, come roll with the Yang Gang.
Hello, nerds.
Hello, nerds!
Welcome to the show. Andrew Flowers from the Bay State, from the great state of Massachusetts. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great, and it's a pleasure and honor to be here.
Well, we're so thrilled to have you. You have many accomplishments under your belt, but one of them is you wrote an article about basic income for 538 years ago. And that really caught my eye. And I was just kind of curious when you were, maybe we could, okay, we'll get into the article in a second. Maybe we'll start with just a quick background on yourself so the audience knows who Andrew Flowers is, and then I can pepper you with questions about the article.
Sounds good. I am an economist and a data journalist, but really my story starts because I grew up in a family that struggled. I'm the oldest of 5 kids. I moved more than 20 times across 5 states before I graduated high school. Saw my parents go bankrupt twice growing up. And as a student in high school, I worked for my dad's janitorial business. So I'd get up before class, and with my brother, we'd clean retail stores and office buildings, and then I'd go to class. So I went to the University of Chicago, studied economics, and really have had over a decade of experience in economics since then, including 5 years at the Federal Reserve during the last financial crisis and Great Recession. But from there, I got a job with Nate Silver at the relaunch of 538 under ABC and ESPN. And that's where I got more fascinated with basic income. And we'll talk about that fascination. And I wrote that long piece about basic income in 2016. But after the election of Donald Trump, I left 538, and for the last 3 years until January, I was an economist with Indeed.com. That's the world's largest job site, and so I was a spokesperson and a researcher about jobs and about automation and about wages and inequality, all kinds of issues in the U.S. labor market. But as you see behind me, I'm on to something new now. I quit my job in January to run for office. I'm running for state representative in the Boston suburbs where I live with my wife and 2 kids, and I'm running as a data-driven Democrat or a pro-growth progressive, and really trying to bring a fresh perspective to Beacon Hill, the state capital here in Massachusetts, and push for some concrete solutions to transportation, housing, climate change.
Wow, that's great. I mean, it's interesting in that as someone who studied economics in the same University of Friedman and wrote an article about basic income and has life experience, working, growing up in a family that didn't have a lot of means, you would imagine you should be Yang Gang like 1,000%. But I don't think you are. And I'm curious what is your view of Yang 2020 and the platform that he was advocating, and what was your take on it?
I really admired and respected the heck out of Andrew Yang's run for the presidency. I really liked a lot of his ideas, but more than his ideas, to be honest, I liked his character and his approach to campaigning. I liked, frankly, his nerdiness when it came to bringing data and argument and not just spinning BS like so many politicians do. Now, I may disagree with him in certain shades when it comes to these issues about automation or basic income, but there are only disagreements in shades. And yes, I do have more of a progressive bent, and so I did like maybe Elizabeth Warren a little more, but some of the traits they shared, even if they're different ideologically, some of the traits in terms of being deep into the issues and trying to win the presidency based on ideas, I respect that. But Andrew Yang, impeccable character, but his ideas about basic income and automation, at least it started a conversation about within the Democratic Party that there is multiple approaches to addressing inequality beyond just the traditional democratic approach of just, investing in government programs. So I support a reclaiming of public power and some progressive ideas, but I also like a lot of the what I call pro-growth progressive ideas that Andrew Yang put out. So I really think Gang has been a huge positive force both within the Democratic Party, but it's going to make the next Democratic president, hopefully Joe Biden, better to have Andrew Yang in his administration.
So where do you fall on the basic income question for Americans? Do you think that's a policy worth trying, or do you feel that its flaws are bigger than its benefits?
It's definitely worth experimenting and tinkering with basic income at the local and state level and seeing what works and what doesn't. The truth is, and not a lot of politicians will tell you this, there's a lot we don't know. And here in Massachusetts, there are two representatives, a representative and a senator in the state legislature who have pushed for a bill to create a pilot program to study basic income. And if I were to be elected, I would fully support that because, well, for two reasons. One, in any state, you have to have a process. And so even though there's been lots of studies about basic income, Massachusetts would need to have this pilot program to begin to consider implementing it as a full-scale program later. So that's one reason I support it. But the second reason is there are lots of pros to the idea. So I love that it's an alternative to the current means testing approach, right? This poverty trap that I wrote about in my piece 4 years ago, and that Andrew Yang talks about, how we're essentially penalizing poor people with very high marginal tax rates under our current social welfare programs. And that with a basic income approach, you both have the liberty and the kind of the cash power of basic income, but you also start to eliminate those means testing flaws. So that's a positive part of the program. And again, I want to see how that applies to Massachusetts. Now, the con to basic income, obviously, is that it's expensive. Oh, there you go. And that's exactly the chart I made a few years ago. It's with outdated data, but the same phenomenon applies today. It really does. And so when you think about a way to enhance the social safety net, both in Massachusetts and other local state governments, we need to experiment with basic income, have a pilot program. Now, the con, of course, and this is where I get a little cold feet, and I laid this out in my piece too, is that it's expensive, right? If you wanted to replace the existing social safety net, and so let's take Andrew Yang's freedom dividend as an example. I have another chart in this piece where I go through and look at all the social spending per capita per month. And when you add it up, Medicare, Social Security, yes, exactly, it still falls short of $1,000 per person per month in the US. So the political reality is it's just impossible to ask everyone to abolish Social Security, abolish Medicare, and replace it with a freedom dividend. And I'm not saying that's what Andrew Yang argued for, but the cost of adding onto the safety net with a basic income or freedom dividend idea is just going to cost trillions of dollars. And I think we need to experiment locally, see what the results are in terms of poverty reduction, the likelihood of people dropping out of the workforce, which, by the way, that's a huge myth about basic income. And Andrew Yang rightfully has been a great advocate saying that it doesn't force people out of the workforce. If anything, in the pilots elsewhere in the world, people stay engaged in work. It just helps them meet their means. So lots of pros, some cons. We have to study it. I would push for this bill to study it in the Massachusetts legislature. And I think it has to be a part of the conversation going forward.
What's your take on raising some revenue through a value-added tax?
So I like the basic income framework for exactly what you're getting after, as a way to essentially rebate a universal tax. Now, whether that's a VAT or a carbon tax, I would actually prefer a carbon tax, but we'll come back to that. For a VAT, I'm a little concerned in the U.S. that sales taxes are some of the most regressive taxes, and when you want to have progressive taxes like income or capital gains taxes, you would want to raise taxes maybe there first versus a VAT. No, European economies just went about a different historical path, and so a lot of advocates for basic income and funding it through a VAT point to Europe and say, well, Europe has a lot of VATs that fund their systems. And I think that's a fair point. So I think we should explore it. I just prefer, rather than a VAT, I would say we need to attack climate change with a carbon tax. And one way basic income can be a great model is it can be a form of rebates through a carbon tax. And so that's something actually I want to push for in Massachusetts is let's have a carbon tax regime, a carbon pricing system, but some share of all the revenue raised does get rebated back in terms of a cash form. That's almost like the Alaska permanent dividend, except you're taxing carbon, but you're rebating it back to people in cash. But in terms of to answer your question and not squirm out of the answer, a VAT is going to be a tough sell politically because it is kind of regressive. You can't unite the left for it, but you also can't unite the right because they're opposed to taxes, period. So it's going to be tough historically to pass a VAT.
Yeah. Do you think it would still be regressive if it were a package deal with basic income? Because I agree, if it was just like, hey, here's a VAT and you get the same services from the government that you used to, then that would be regressive. But it's, oh, and on top of this, yes, you have the VAT, but now you're getting a check every month.
That's a good point. And again, this is where I want to admit my own ignorance of the specifics. I get your argument, and I think it as a package deal could be sold as a progressive reform. But those specifics really matter. And I think that's a point well taken. It could be sold potentially as a progressive package.
Well, Andrew, tell me a little bit about Massachusetts. I had the privilege of living there for several years, but it's been a while. So what are like the local issues that are important to the Bay State voters, and has the BLM movement and those questions, has that emerged at all in with your constituents?
For sure. I mean, the way I talk about this is that there was the pre-coronavirus world and the pre-George Floyd world, and then there's the world we live in now. So when I first launched my campaign in January, I was really running, and I still am, because this is the blocking and tackling of local government. I was running on issues like transportation, housing, and climate change. And I can talk about those issues, but the reality is voters and government agencies aren't as focused on those medium to long-term problems. They're focused on the immediate crises we face with the public health recovery from COVID-19. And Massachusetts has done, I think, a pretty decent job, both in our phased reopening of the economy, but also in terms of how our public health response was able to relatively early have a stay-at-home order and reduce the peak caseload to not overwhelm our healthcare system. But that said, while we peaked at several hundred deaths a day, sadly, a few months ago, we're now in the 40, 50 deaths a day, and we are being vigilant to monitor for any second spike. So as we reopen the economy, that's the top priority is COVID-19 public health risk, but also the various sectors like restaurants, retail workers that are trying to get the economy going again. Those are the immediate public health crises going into Memorial Day. And then George Floyd was murdered. And I have been in this dark year in terms of our president, in terms of the economy, in terms of COVID. I've actually seen the murder of George Floyd and all the rightful protests that it ignited. And I have participated in over half a dozen Black Lives Matter protests in my district, in the Boston suburbs. In the last 10 days, I've participated in these protests. And in this dark year, that's been a glimmer of hope. That's been a positive sign, because you see a very multiracial, multi-generational coalition of people out in the streets. And every protest I've been to has been peaceful. And so the Black Lives Matter movement, I think, has galvanized everyone to say, we really have three immediate short-term crises. We have the COVID public health crises, the economy crisis, and we have racial injustice. And so that, frankly, is what I'm most focused on in the immediate term, because I think that's what we have to fix. But again, those long festering issues with a broken transportation system, with housing that we have to really address, and with climate change, those are still there.
I'd love to hear a little bit about the transportation system for two reasons. One is when I was in Boston, there was the Big Dig and that was a very large project. And then I've had the opportunity the last few years to live in Switzerland, where they have a very efficient public transportation system. And I was kind of curious, what is your vision for Massachusetts public transportation system, or transportation in general?
Yeah, I am blessed to live in Massachusetts, and in the greater Boston area. The metro area in particular is in many cases a wealth of riches. We have an incredible labor market. We have world-leading universities. The industries that offer growth and support the tax base are really world-class in terms of biopharmaceuticals, finance, tech. So we have great schools. Within the United States, Massachusetts regularly ranks #1 in public education in the country. But what is holding back this economy and this really society here in Massachusetts, I truly believe, is our transportation system. So Boston ranks #1 in terms of the worst gridlock, worst traffic in the country, and the 8th worst gridlock in the world. And that's just cars on the highway. In terms of the actual commuter rail, the train network that goes out from Boston, and the subway system, the T within Boston, that is broken. And we've had over 40 derailments in the last 5 years, meaning a train has gone off the rails 40 times.
Literally.
In the last 5 years, literally. Yeah. And so there are just numerous issues with delays, with fare hikes, but declining service quality. So I truly believe that until we fix transportation, we're going to have this bottleneck on our economic growth, because too many people are being forced to live further and further out. And my district that I'm running in, I'm running to represent parts or all of 4 towns: Walpole, Mansfield, Sharon, and Stoughton. This district I'm running in is ground zero for the transportation crisis, because of all the districts, the 160 state rep districts in the state, we have the 2nd highest average commute time to work at almost 40 minutes. So whether you're driving and getting stuck in traffic from my district going into Boston, or you're on a delayed commuter rail train that's overcrowded with higher fare hikes and the chance of it not being safe, running off the rails, it's an issue we have to solve. Now, to answer your question, what's my vision? That's the problem. I've articulated the problem. The vision is building a green transportation infrastructure that is affordable and reliable. And it has to be green because, and again, I'm a numbers guy, the largest source of carbon emissions in Massachusetts is the transportation sector at over 40%. And we can't really address our climate issues long-term, nor our transportation bottleneck short-term, until we start to reinvest in our existing assets and transition them to electric buses, electric trains, and make them more reliable in the sense of more frequent service, more options for riders to jump on the commuter rail or jump on a bus. And that's going to take money. And we have to think about what's the sensible, progressive way to reinvest in our transportation system. And for the existing assets, it's gonna require what I believe is the millionaire's tax, a fair share amendment, which would be a surtax of 4% on incomes above $1 million here in Massachusetts. That is a dedicated revenue source for transportation and education funding to upgrade existing assets and make them green. But for the roads, and this is where the economist, the nerd in me comes out, the final thing I'll say is we need congestion pricing, which is just a proven mechanism all around the world, where you vary the time of day tolls based upon traffic demand of cars on the road, and it reduces, just by supply and demand, who would have think it, reduces the traffic on the roads. Boston is the only city among the top 10 metro areas that doesn't have any form of congestion pricing. And so no wonder we have the worst traffic. And there's ways to do this that are progressive. What I found are means-based congestion pricing, which again is like basic income in this notion of a carbon tax and a cash refund. You can essentially have the little monitors that are on cars for tolls, so that people have means-based congestion pricing, and so that someone who's working a minimum wage job doesn't have to pay the same toll as our doctors and workers at Google here. So those are my set ideas in terms of green infrastructure investments and time of day congestion pricing mechanism. that has to help solve our transportation issues, and that will unleash our growth going forward.
So about the transportation thing, one of the things I've noticed living a little bit overseas and then also just observing other countries is that many countries do not have this assumption that everybody has a right or expectation to own their own personal vehicle. And my son was asking me the other day, why are the Swiss trains, generally pretty nice and clean and on time? And I said, well, like the country here does not spend as much on cars because most people actually, if they own them, they may own one, and many of people don't own any. And a lot of the money that would have been spent on everybody having their own car goes to taxes that then invest in a really world-class transportation system. And I'm curious, do you think the time has come for we as Americans to kind of say, well, there's another way where if we all don't own two cars and we all don't drive individually to work, like we can actually have it better for everyone. But it does take, I would imagine it would take a concerted effort. Like it's hard to spend all this money and for people to spend all their money on cars and then tax them for a big public transportation system that they won't quote unquote need because they just bought this, new Lexus or whatever.
I think you really hit onto something, and there's two ways I want to respond to that. One is to say, I think that the connection compared to Europe that we need to make in the United States is that transit and housing go hand in hand. And part of the issue in America is housing density through really poor zoning laws, in my opinion, and Massachusetts is a great example of this, have kind of incentivized a multiple car culture per household. So in other words, to get to this vision that you're articulating of encouraging people, incentivizing people to just have one, maybe no cars, to get there, we need to change our housing policies. That's my first thing. And I can elaborate more on what I mean by that in terms of encouraging more multifamily, dense development. But it's transit-oriented development. We need transit-oriented development because it's both greener, it's better for the climate, but it's also, frankly, going to be a solution to our housing crisis. So besides transportation holding us back, another huge issue holding us back is the exorbitant cost of housing. Boston is regularly probably the third most expensive metro area for housing behind the Bay Area and New York City. And when you look at housing production, and again, here's me, the economist, the kind of yang gang numbers guy, is that you look at the housing production in Massachusetts by decade, and it shockingly falls each decade since the 70s. We're not building enough housing. And part of that is, white flight and racial segregation and white suburbs essentially creating single family only zoning and pulling up the gates to minority communities that would want to live there, literally or figuratively, through zoning. And so that has caused housing production to decline because it's more expensive to build, a 1 acre lot, $1 million home than it is to build and again, I'm not talking about huge apartment complexes. What I like to talk about when it comes to transit-oriented development is the missing middle. Things like duplexes, triplexes, simple 4 to 8 unit multifamily apartments or condos that so many suburban communities, not just in Boston, in the Boston area, but throughout the country, have essentially outlawed. And until we have a kind of YIMBY, yes in my backyard mentality to housing, we're not actually going to fix our housing crisis by building up more production. And we're actually not going to fix our transportation crisis. So this is where I'm going back to your question, is that to have a society where people feel comfortable owning one car, you need denser development near those transit stations. And right now we have this backwards mentality where we say how when we look at transit locations, clusters in America, we tend to build parking lots. Like on that land, municipal governments tend to build parking lots so people can drive from their single family home and get on a train, when it should be the opposite. That's where you would want to build multifamily housing. So I think your articulated vision for a kind of a greener, more transit-oriented culture starts with fixing housing. But there's a separate point I wanted to make. The second point is, Tom, this COVID experience, I think is going to be an inflection point when it comes to transit. Why? Because two things. One, people are at home more. They're realizing they don't need to commute to many of their jobs. But also, and this is happening in my town, it's happening in many cities, they're closing off streets in downtown areas to expand restaurant capacity to have outdoor dining. So it's safer. And people who are used to driving to a restaurant in their car and driving to a downtown area, they realize that these streets are closed off and that it's walkable and that it's al fresco dining, and they love it. They enjoy it, and they want to see urban planning. I hope, coming out of this COVID experience, I hope Americans change their attitude towards urban planning and want to have more carless streets, right? Really just open green space in downtown areas and not be so fixated on parking and driving. And so that's one of my positives coming out of this COVID experience.
Yeah, one thing that comes to mind when you talk about that is I wonder if it's a big cultural shift for some people, in that, at least when I was growing up, the vision for success in America was big house, picket fence, big driveway, 2-car garage, pool in the back. And what you're describing is these denser, walkable public transportation. That I've experienced both. I like both. I quite like the convenience of the European method, but I could see a lot of people saying, "Hey, Andrew, this is that's not America. You know, America. I have a right to my 2 cars, my Smith & Wesson, my pool. You know, get your European ideas out of here." Do you get any pushback, or do you feel like people are ready for a different approach?
I definitely get pushback. I'm the chair of the Affordable Housing Committee, or it's called the Housing Partnership, that works collaboratively with private developers to build affordable housing in my town. I chair that, and I'm running as a candidate on housing, both because of my personal experience growing up so nomadically, like I mentioned, moving all the time. I never went to the same the school for 2 years in a row until 11th grade. So I know what housing instability is like, but running as a pro-housing candidate in a suburban area is, to many people, kind of a death wish. But I actually am not finding that. I'm finding that when you explain the long-term trends here and what we're facing as a society, they listen. So to your point about preferences are preferences. Some people will like the space of the suburbs. I'm not taking that away. What I'm saying is we have a demographic shift happening in this country where baby boomers who are retiring have these large homes and they're looking to downsize. And they have few options to downsize into condos or smaller developments. And their kids, like millennials my age, are having fewer children. I have 2 kids, a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, and I was the oldest of 5, right? So not only are millennials having fewer kids than boomers, they're also preferring more walkable, denser communities. So you have this demographic shift happening where boomers want to downsize but don't have any options. Millennials with kids want more walkable space, but they don't have any options, because all that exists, and this is enforced by law, all that exists are large single-family lots, and it's illegal to build. That's what I hope people understand. It's not that I'm banning the American dream of the picket fence and the pool and the Smith & Wesson. I'm just saying, let us have the dream of living in a 2 or 3 bedroom apartment that's 1,500, 1,800 square feet. That's a part of a triplex, and it's in a kind of cluster village development. That's illegal in so many communities throughout the United States to even build that way. And there's racism and there's other reasons for that in terms of the history why zoning was written that way. But we have to kind of address this heads on. So to your answer, of course, if your preference is to live in a rural area or to have a 2-acre lot in a large single-family home, you are going to have plenty of options in the coming years as boomers downsize. Let other people with different preferences, just let them follow those preferences. But we have this NIMBY mentality, at least in the suburbs, which prevents people from even allowing their neighbors to build denser multifamily housing.
What's your take on, in terms of housing, the mortgage interest rate, interest deduction? I've heard some people argue that this was a policy developed when everybody had to own their own place, and that was viewed as part of the American dream. But that it kind of distorts the market, and it encourages people to potentially tie up too much of their worth in one asset. Any thoughts on that, since we're talking about housing?
I am so glad you bring it up, Tom, because it has to go. It is a terrible policy. It's regressive. It exacerbates inequality, and it distorts the housing market. That's my short answer to answer your question. But to elaborate on it, this is what's amazing to me. And this is what I'm going back to my pitch at the beginning. As a pro-growth progressive, what I want to, seek social and economic justice, right? I want to kind of use the power of the state when necessary to have public goods, invest in education and infrastructure, sure. But the pro-growth part of it is that we also need to kind of cultivate industries that are the tax base. We need to, not always have an antagonistic attitude to business. But how does it relate to housing? This notion of being a pro-growth progressive. It's this. So much of the U.S. tax code is regressive, not just in the sense that we don't tax rich people enough. It's not so much that. When you actually look at the amount of taxes the U.S. raises from people at the top of the income spectrum, just the amount we raise, the gross amount, it's actually pretty progressive. I'm not saying we shouldn't have more progressive income taxes, we should. But what makes the US regressive is that it's not that we don't tax rich people enough, it's that we tax them pretty high, and then we give them all these goodies back in the tax code. And the worst goodie we give back, the worst regressive kickback we give to rich people is the mortgage interest deduction. It is, trillions and trillions of dollars over the last few decades. We're essentially funneling to people who have second homes, vacation homes, who have, $1 million larger homes, because there's no cap to it. There's no limit either in terms of per houses or amount per home. So what it does is it encourages people to take on more debt. It encourages people to, especially wealthier people, to invest more in housing because it's protected by the tax code. And we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars a year that we just waste on this mortgage interest deduction. Plenty of other societies have really robust housing markets without this subsidy that encourages debt. And so that's my elaborate answer to explain pro-growth progressive, is that it's not about raising taxes on rich people. It's about cutting the goodies that the tax code gives rich people already, like these deductions, like the mortgage interest deduction.
So I applaud you for coming out so clearly on that, because I have to believe there are some constituents out there who are saying, whoa, I bought this overpriced house partly because I knew it was being subsidized by the government. If you take away this interest policy, I wouldn't have bought this thing. I would have bought a smaller place, and now I'm screwed. What would you say to them?
I think there are phased ways to do it, phase outs that we can do over even a decade. But the simple math here matters. When you have over $500 billion, being wasted, in my opinion, on the mortgage interest deduction, and you have, a small fraction of that even being invested in affordable housing, it's an injustice. And I think the question for those wealthier folks, or even middle-class folks who think the mortgage interest deduction is critical to their lifestyle, I think this is a ripe issue for moderates and even Republicans to run on, to say, you know what, even if you don't agree with Andrew, who would like to invest it in affordable housing, at least let's take the money that we're wasting on the deduction and cut your taxes, make it revenue neutral. That's a minimum. So to those folks who are worried about, wait a second, I invested in this big house, and now you're not going to give me as much of a kickback in terms of the mortgage interest deduction. The argument is, well, we could lower your marginal tax rates. And that's the starting point in the negotiations. I would actually try to make the argument that we could lower or limit the increase of future taxes by repealing this mortgage interest deduction, but also use some of those funds to invest in affordable housing. So that's the argument I make. And I think there's, again, phased ways to do this that don't disrupt the housing market as is.
Let's talk a little bit about education, since you are in a state that is known for many great educational institutions. One of the things that Andrew Yang was advocating was that maybe we're over prescribing college. and that the traditional kind of progressive platform of more grants for college tuition and more loans may not necessarily result in people acquiring skills that allow them to generate earnings to compensate for the 4 years and all of that debt. He was advocating for more vocational training and kind of other alternatives where people learn different kinds of trades and skills. Any thoughts on education?
For sure. For higher education specifically, I'm a big believer in debt-free higher education, but not a believer in free, zero-cost higher education, at least for 4 years. I think a 2-year guarantee, say in Massachusetts, for anyone, and not just high school seniors, not just people with a GED, anyone, 2 years of either vocational, community college, or 4-year public education for free for 2 years as a starting point. So whether you're going to the UMass Amherst Honors College and you're going to eventually go to, say, Harvard Business School, your first 2 years are free. Or if you're in your mid-50s and you're fired from a manufacturing plant and you want to go back to a vocational trade school for 2 years to get your license in plumbing or be an electrician, what have you, that's free for 2 years. The reason I agree with Andrew in that the whole 4-year college mentality is just overblown, or it's too much of a one-size-fits-all. The reason I agree with that is with Andrew is the same reason I agree with his vision that we're going through the fourth industrial revolution. Even if I think maybe the automation issues are not as severe as he plays them up to be, I agree with him that we don't know what the future holds, and that we need to have a more flexible education system where people can switch careers halfway through, say 20 years, and they are a worker at an auto manufacturing plant, and then they want to switch to be a nurse or a computer programmer even. We need to have the flexibility that the jobs of the future are unknown. And so many of these jobs that we think we should invest in today may be gone, either because of trade or because of automation in the future. And so because of that mentality of the uncertainty in the labor market, I think we can't have this one size fits all of like, yeah, everyone should go to school for 4 years for college and it should be free. Well, I'm just not quite sold on that. I'm really not. And so I think 2 years is a good stepping stone, and it should apply across all types of education at all ages so that we have that flexibility to adapt to the fourth industrial revolution.
Got it. I'm about to ask for audience questions, but before I get to any questions from the folks watching right now, I was curious to ask you about healthcare, because in a lot of ways, Massachusetts was discussed as a blueprint for Obamacare. And obviously that ACA bill has been sort of modified in recent years. But how is healthcare in the Bay State these days?
So there are pros and cons. So really the 2006 reform, the Romney Care, the precursor to Obamacare, was an access reform bill. And so what it did was it had the same structure that we later saw in the ACA, where there was an individual mandate and there was a goal towards universal health insurance within the state. And when you look at the share of people uninsured, Massachusetts ranks near the bottom because we have this reform, this access reform, that expanded access, that increased risk pools, that had the state level exchanges, all these precursors. We were the blueprint for Obamacare, but only when it came to access. So I am very proud of Massachusetts that compared to other states, and for example, my mother in Oklahoma didn't have health insurance last year. She's not yet old enough to qualify for Medicare. And so she had to get an MRI. I had to loan her $500 last December. Oklahoma didn't expand the exchanges or didn't have as much access reform as Massachusetts does. And that's a policy failure. So that's a pro in Massachusetts camp. But where's the con? We have among the highest healthcare costs in the country, right? So that 2006 Romney Care was an access reform, and it was smart in some ways. But right now, Mass Health is the kind of state agency that administers all of our health insurance, is 40% of our budget. We have over a $45 billion $45 billion with a B budget here in Massachusetts at the state level, and 40% of it, 40%, over 16 billion of it, is just mass health. So we have among the highest healthcare cost growth in the country. So the lesson here is not don't do access reform, don't expand health insurance access. I think the lesson is healthcare costs are really tough to tackle at the state level. That because of the kind of multi-state nature of hospital companies, of provider networks, and of the health insurers themselves, that it's really hard to do healthcare cost containment. It's hard to contain the cost of an appendectomy in Massachusetts when the pressure that behind the hospital bill, the surgeon bill, and the health insurer, when the pressure for that appendectomy bill is ballooning across the country. It's ballooning in New York and Connecticut and all the neighboring northeastern states. We can, as a state, only do so much for healthcare cost containment. That's why we really need national healthcare cost containment, and it starts not just with the insurers. That's the first place it starts, because as you know, having living now in Switzerland, it's just a different mentality we have in America with the private health insurance market just unusually expensive, causing U.S. healthcare to be unusually expensive. But my argument is it's not just health insurance companies that are bad. And again, maybe this is me making enemies where I shouldn't, but it's also providers. We also have some of the most expensive providers in the country. So we have to start to address this healthcare cost containment. But unfortunately, I think the most successful reforms are going to come at the national level, because we've tried and we're not having great success, honestly, in Massachusetts.
Yeah, it's I did a video a couple weeks ago about comparing like U.S. costs for common procedures versus every other developed country, and it's absurd. I mean, of course, everybody talks about how American pharmaceuticals are cheaper outside of America, but also like if you need a hip replacement, a knee replacement, any major procedure, and I'm not comparing it to like Thailand. I'm saying like United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, France, like a third of the costs, and it's just it's shocking how as a country we're so inefficient with our money, because it's now like nationally 20% of the GDP. But I agree with you. That may not be solvable at the Massachusetts level. That may need a little bit of help from DC.
For sure. And you know, it's sad that it's both the least efficient system, it's the most expensive per capita, but it's a tragedy that it's that, and we have some of the worst outcomes, right? In terms of infant mortality or maternal mortality or diabetes and heart disease. We have limited gains in life expectancy. And actually, in recent years, due to deaths of despair, we've had declining life expectancy among white people in America. And it's just a travesty that as some subgroups of our population are having reduced life expectancy, we have the most expensive healthcare in the country, in the world. So that's got to be priority number one, along with climate change at the federal level.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue our healthcare system is pretty regressive in that if you're of means, you can get, you go to Mass General, you're going to get the world's best care. But if you don't have a lot of resources, then you're seeing different outcomes for sure. Here's a question from Trev Third. What do you think about the Fed chairman saying that, we can just produce as much money as we want, that we can continuously ease the financial system and stimulate our way out of this recession?
Well, I don't know if that was the exact quote from Jerome Powell. Maybe it is. I'm not disputing Trev Third. I'm just trying to remember what I've heard the leadership of the Fed say recently regarding supporting the recovery during COVID. And I think the response has been really good. I'll be honest with you, from the Fed, because I was at the Fed from 2008 through 2014. And the biggest critical failure in that moment, and it was a different type of shock, right? It was a financial shock, a credit crunch that started in the banking system and propagated out. This is a lot different. This is a demand shock. People are staying home and not spending money because of a pandemic. So while it's a different situation, the lesson I learned in 2008 to 2009 was the Fed didn't act quickly enough in terms of not just cutting interest rates, not just in terms of quantitative easing, buying government assets or even private assets to lower long-term interest rates. The Fed didn't do enough fast enough, because by reacting, almost overreacting in the early months of a crisis, you're really saving yourself millions, billions, maybe trillions in the future, because you supported the businesses that would have otherwise gone bankrupt, or the homes that would have otherwise been foreclosed. So I like the really aggressive response. I like the Fed's municipal lending facility. That's huge, because a huge unspoken issue that doesn't get a lot of press is that it's state and local governments who are really suffering right now. So you saw in the last jobs report in May that while there was a 2.5 million bounce back in U.S. jobs as retailers and restaurants started to open up, there were still hundreds of thousands of cuts in the firefighters, police officers, teachers at the state and local level. So the Fed's municipal lending facility is a big plus. Buying all the assets in terms of lowering long-term rates, a big plus. But to answer Trev third, is it true? And let's do this thought experiment, because people on the MMT spectrum who believe in modern monetary theory, will say there's just no limit in terms of what the Fed can spend. There really is no limit. I think it's partially correct in that the limit is not that the Fed's ability to print money. It's the public's willingness to buy into the Fed's inflation mandate. And if the Fed ever loses credibility, and if inflation starts to drift higher and the Fed continues to ease, that's when you can get into a problem in terms of escalating inflation. But I think that's the exact opposite problem we face. We face a huge deflationary shock right now. And I think the best thing the Fed can do is to say, we'll do whatever it takes. So I like what Jerome Powell said. He said, we will do whatever it takes. We'll expand our balance sheet by several more trillion if we have to, because look at Japan, look at the EU, their central banks are able to have much higher, balance sheets compared to the GDP than we do, and support their economy. And so I think it's the right approach.
And what are your thoughts on these stimulus packages that sent most of the money to industry or corporations, or very specific programs, versus obviously a biased question here, just giving the people the money directly and cutting out all that, all the intermediaries?
This is where I'm yang all the way. I think that the most successful parts of these last 3 or 4 stimulus bills have been the direct cash assistance, whether that was through the stimulus checks mailed to most households, $1,200 a person, or whether, and this is also kind of a form of a basic income, the $600 a week and the pandemic unemployment assistance, that extra unemployment insurance payment and cash. That's been huge to maintain spending and maintain the economy. And again, those are the best parts, and they're a small fraction of all the trillions we've been spending. It's the cash that we need. Now, in terms of the business support, I'm not saying just let businesses go bankrupt and there shouldn't be any kind of facility to make loans. But what we've had is an enormous facility, over $500 billion, that's really made grants, and those grants have mostly gone to the most successful companies and big industries. So you've had Boeing of the world get these billions of dollars, when childcare providers, people who are going to go under because they don't have, the very low margin businesses that are huge to our economy, small businesses, didn't get the same bailout. And that's where it's frustrating for me. That's where I think the justice in terms of the politics makes more sense to just give people cash.
Andrew, you may not know it, but you're pretty much on your way to Yang Gang, which is a great thing. Elizabeth Norris, who's a member of the channel, thank you for your support, Elizabeth, has a question about transportation in rural areas of the country. Now, this is, I think, is a great point in that it's easy for me to live in Switzerland, very small country, highly concentrated. I'm in Zurich. So we can have a train system where everyone can get to the airport, no problem. But America is a much larger area, and it would be really expensive to have public transportation kind of reach out to if you live in a very rural area. What are your thoughts on transportation for folks who don't live in the city center?
I think it's a great question. I'm not extremely well versed because I live in a pretty dense suburb of Boston. Massachusetts is even the suburbs are pretty dense. But my first thought is when you think of high-speed rail and the kind of cluster connections that could come about that if we had high-speed rail. And so, to give a concrete example, in Massachusetts, there's a west east rail idea being floated out there that would link Springfield and some of the Western Mass cities to a train line going right into Boston. So in theory, someone could live in Western Mass and commute into Boston and not have to, drive the 2 hours each way. So that is one way. As an example, maybe at the state level, we do kind of pilots where we have large train links that maybe link Columbus and Cleveland, or Richmond and Norfolk. I mean, it's going to vary by the state. I'm just throwing those pairs of cities out there. But the idea is, and by the way, I mentioned Richmond and Norfolk because Virginia just passed an amazing train rail bill. And I don't know all the details, but I was following it loosely from afar just this year, just before COVID. And how does this relate to rural transportation is, if you have at least some hub and spoke network that a rural person could drive to and be connected to that network, that's one way to address rural transportation. But the last thing I'll say is that our threshold for public transportation, I think, has gotten too high in this country, in the sense of we need them to be these big, large, all-encompassing systems like the MBTA and the T, which are the train and subway systems here in Massachusetts. When really, what really makes sense are smaller regional transit authorities. And we have these RTAs in Massachusetts. What they are is, in many cases, they're shuttle and bus services that serve a kind of very small, mid-sized metro area. So something like Fall River or New Bedford, not Boston. And this model, where it's not even about rail, it's about shuttles from city centers to parking lots on the outside of cities, so that you have people in the rural areas who drive into the outskirts and then can take a shuttle to the city center. That kind of mentality of, say, let's lower our, almost ironically, it says lower your ambition, create smaller regional transit authorities where you have, say, 20 buses, and invest in that rather than billions of dollars in rail. And that really helps the rural areas the most.
Yeah, makes a ton of sense. Like sometimes I will take a bus from my house here to the train station like 10 minutes away, and then take a train into the city, and works fine. But you need a very frequent and reliable bus schedule, which luckily, we have here. But when I lived in Seattle, it was like half the time the bus would just not even show up, and it'd be like an hour or something.
Yes.
Harkins has a question. What are your thoughts about these provider costs for healthcare being high, partly because of litigation and malpractice suits, and just like the way our system's set up?
Sure, it's a great question, and I should preface it by saying I'm no healthcare policy expert, right? I have a background in economics, and I've done a lot of local work on housing and zoning. So those are the issues I know best. That said, when you talk about malpractice and you talk about solutions to lower healthcare costs, whether it's through tort reform or other ideas that often come from, say, the right, and I think that there should be part of the solution, right? In terms of, if we have high levels of malpractice, tort reform and legal liability changes should be part of a fix. My understanding, though, and this is where I think that we should be realistic, is cutting down on malpractice and pushing for tort reform is just going to be a very small part of the big solution. Like, yes, it'll help healthcare cost containment, but it's not. It's going to be a little piece of the puzzle, right? I think really the health insurance cost and the hospital and provider cost are, like, those are the big rocks we got to fix first, and then tort reform can come later.
Gotcha. Question from Landline, also a channel member. Thank you, Landline, for your support. How would you tax Amazon, or is the sales tax sufficient?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question, because in Massachusetts, we're debating different ways to raise revenue progressively in the face of this recession and shortfall, right? We're going to have an $8 billion budget deficit potentially. And one argument is, well, just cut all the firefighters and teachers to make the budgets balanced, because unlike the federal government, state and local governments have to balance their budgets. But I don't agree with that austerity approach. I think we need to support essential public services. And so I think we're going to have to raise revenue progressively in the face of this recession. And one idea being floated out there, and it's actually two ideas, is a tiered minimum corporate tax. So what this is, it's a tax not based on like a corporate income or corporate sales, but on corporate revenue. So in other words, Amazon has been so successful at not paying taxes because they're not really making much profit, right? The taxes typically are on profit. They're reinvesting their surplus revenues into the company in terms of, taking that cash flow and expanding. And that's great in the sense of it's hiring more people, it's growth and it's innovation. But at some point, when you're worth $1 trillion and your revenue is billions and billions of dollars a year, I think you need to consider a revenue tax. Now, there's ways to do it that are tiered because you don't want to tax revenue on a business that's operating a loss, right? Because you're just going to expedite them into bankruptcy. But for the large companies, if they're essentially net zero profit like Amazon, I think a revenue tax or a tiered corporate minimum tax is in order. So that's how I would do it.
Right on, Andrew. We're almost out of time. But I wanted to ask you, are there any topics that are near and dear to you that we didn't touch on that we should chat about before we wrap up?
Yes. The last thing I'll talk about, it's not about data and it's not about economics. And I do want to emphasize it at the beginning. I mentioned Black Lives Matter and racial injustice and police reform. That is huge. And I'm really reaching out to activists and experts and especially people of color to put forth a really robust racial justice agenda. But again, putting all those issues aside, one of the reasons I'm running is even though I'm a Democrat, I believe that a lot of democratically run state houses have fallen into complacency. And here in Massachusetts, we need state house reform. So for a lot of your viewers who aren't living in the Bay State, they may not see why this matters. But I hope to have a template where other reformers across the country, other Democrats, can kind of take on the Democratic establishment in their state. Because in many ways, I am running against that. And by state house reform, I really mean concrete ways to increase transparency. So the last thing I'll say is Massachusetts is one of the least transparent state governments in the country. And that's not empty talk. So we're the only state where both the governor, the state house, and the state senate, all three branches are exempt from public records requests, FOIA requests. So that they won't comply. Number one, that's a huge issue in terms of transparency. But more so for the seat I'm running in the state house, a lot of the votes, the floor votes, the kind of ways to hold your reps accountable, your senators accountable, they're just missing because there's few, if any, recorded votes. In other words, they take these votes in secret. So again, I'm not like on a soapbox, a crazy guy, screaming into the ether. These are really tangible reforms that are simple. You should be able to publish all your votes. You should have a record, a roll call for all your committee and floor votes. And that way voters and interest groups can hold you accountable. And that way you're taking on the establishment as is. And again, I'm a Democrat. I believe in the party going forward, but we need to be introspective and look at, especially in these one-party states like Massachusetts, where there's a veto-proof majority, we need not be complacent. And we need to say, we need to reform ourselves to gain credibility for the future.
What is the argument for not publishing each individual's votes?
It's a great non-argument. So the way it works in Massachusetts is if there's a floor vote in the whole House chamber, you can motion for a roll call if 10% of the chamber agrees to it. Most of the time that's frowned on. So you just have a voice vote. But the really pernicious thing is that the votes that matter aren't on the floor. They're at the committee level. So, like any state house in the country, the reps are going to have a transportation committee, a housing committee. Well, those committees don't have to publish their votes. So what this allows you to do, Tom, this is insane to me, is that as a rep, you can tell your constituent, look them in the eye and say, oh yeah, I support that bill on animal welfare or whatever that you want me to vote on. But then in the committee that you're on, you can secretly vote to kill it and they'll never know.
Wow. That's not
acceptable. Yeah.
That's quite disturbing in such a historic state for the country and a state with such, highly educated people how is that? How is that okay? That's so undemocratic in a way. One last thing I would love to ask you, Andrew, is like on this show, we talk to a lot of Yang Gang running for Congress, for Senate, state house, that kind of thing. I've heard this theme that, it's usually millennials. They're advocating for basic income, for democracy dollars, like where everybody gets money that they can donate to kind of level the fundraising playing field. And they encounter opposition, not just from Republicans, but from Democrats, from the Democratic Party establishment. And I was curious, you're not as, you're not pushing for all of the Yang stuff. So maybe people think you're more kind of centrist, but you're not, you are younger and you're not coming from, the traditional power base. Have you encountered, what's it been like as a new voice?
Well, I should say that people definitely don't see me as a centrist, and I wouldn't see myself as a centrist at all. I really see myself as a progressive reformer, though, right? And so I may have an independent mind, and I may not agree with every issue on the progressive left, but in terms of the values of social and economic justice, yes, I agree with that. But you're absolutely right. Just because I have an independent mind and a data-driven approach, I absolutely run into obstacles within the Democratic Party. And it's people who really don't like my positions on housing or education, and especially don't like that I'm going to go after the current state house culture, because even in a state house where 80% of the members are Democrats, and in the Senate, it's 90% are Democrats, my argument is the Republican governor, and we have a very popular Republican governor here in Massachusetts, he's actually not the obstacle. And so I'm telling the Democratic establishment, Democratic voters, stop fixating on this like faux enemy in our governor. And yeah, I disagree with them on a lot of things, but like the real obstacle to progress is ourselves. And that argument alone, in addition to the kind of progressive out there ideas, and yeah, I'm very Yang curious is the way I would put it. Even though if I'm not 100% on board, I really respected the campaign he ran, and his ideas I've tried to learn from and adopt them. And so just articulating those independent ideas are going to get you opposition. But my message to any viewer watching is, so be it. Adopt a so be it attitude. Run and be yourself, be authentic. No one needs a stuffed shirt, a kind of blow dry politician. We're over that. And the singular act of Yang not wearing a tie, I know this is kind of a dumb point, but it really matters, because we need to change the optics of who politicians are and cut back on the BS. And Yang did that, and I want to follow in those footsteps.
Right on, Andrew. Well, I love your data-driven approach. I love you may not wear a math hat, but you certainly are trying to make America think harder. And so I think you're transitioning from Yang Curious a little more, but which is a great compliment in this channel. And I wish you all the best, because I think one of the things about Yang is not just the policy positions he was going for, but just the approach, the pragmatic, like, hey, let's figure out what's the root cause. What does the data say? And then let's figure out how we can fix this thing. And maybe the solution that we land isn't necessarily on the Democrat formulary or on the Republican formulary, but it's just works. And then let's just try what works, because clearly business as usual is not really working that great for us. So I'll keep my fingers crossed. When's the big day for you? When will you?
It's September 1st is the primary, and it being Massachusetts, there is no Republican on the ballot. So it's really just I win the Democratic primary and I win the election. So please check out andrewflowers.com. Throw a few bucks if you can. I appreciate it. But September 1st is the date, and I really am honored to be here on the show, Tom. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. So if you're watching this and if you're in Massachusetts, definitely check out Andrew Flowers. If you have friends that are in Mass, let them know. Share this interview with them. And if you like his approach and your view is you want more people that think independently and are more evidence-based and less kind of dogmatic, consider contributing to Andrew Flowers' campaign, because I think ultimately what we need are representatives that can solve problems. And you seem like someone that's looking at stuff and knows your way around a few charts as well, which is always a big plus in my book.
Thank you, Tom. And thank you for doing the critical work you're doing at elevating the conversation.
Doing my best. With that, we're going to say goodbye, nerds.
Goodbye.